right, it's my great pleasure to welcome everyone to this Surana and Surana International series on knowledge, and the theme is the national monetization policy that we picked. My name is Sudarshan. I'm the Dean of the Jindal School of Government and Public Policy in the OP Jindal Global University. And on behalf of the Vice Chancellor and the university, I'm very happy that we are partnering once again in this year with Surana and Surana International and with Dr. Vinod Surana in having this kind of a conversation on an important policy theme. I'm very, very pleased to say that we have an excellent set of speakers on the panel, persons with great experience and knowledge of the subject. And, we couldn't have asked for a better group than we have on this particular theme. And I'm especially grateful to Dr. Ajay Shah for accepting my request on behalf of the university to join the panel. We have, Professor Arvind Mukherjee, Mr. Arvind Mayaram, and Mr. Arun Balakrishnan. And we have Nikhil Nagavan, we can see on the screen. So we've got a great lineup of people who can contribute to the discussion. So my job is simply to say that, I was just mentioning that the term monetization policy is a bit confusing because a lay person might think it is the opposite of a demonetization policy. But this has been recently announced in the budget, and Niti Aayog has produced 2 volumes trying to explain the rationale for this policy, which is in some ways to supplement the resources that are needed for a very ambitious infrastructure development program of the government. 111 lakh crores anticipated as needed, and to contribute to that, they want to leave no stone unturned, tap every source of money that's possible. And so what this plan is meant to do is to kind of earn on the one part revenue or money for the government, but also to make use of what you might call idle capital or infrastructure that is underutilized, but which has the potential to be better utilized. And the hope is that there would be private sector investors who find this attractive and who will come to the government or the concerned authority that owns the infrastructure. And it's really, and it's very appropriate that a law firm should initiate this discussion, because this has to do with not a straightforward sale, which most people will understand. An asset is transferred from one entity to another, but that doesn't happen here. What happens here is the user rights for the asset is transferred, and the time period or the lease period is stipulated. All of this has to do with law. I think the entire success or failure of this policy will turn on how well the contracts are drawn up, how clear they are, because at some point the asset that belongs to the public, the taxpayer or the government, is to be returned to the ownership of the government. And so this means that everything must be very clear and transparent, and this is a big challenge. So it's very good that a public policy school like ours, Dr. Ajay Shah and all of you are putting our heads together this afternoon to figure out what's up. Because if you read the 2 documents published by Niti Aayog, you do not get any hint of potential problems. There is sections which say other countries have done it, and reference to Australia or some other country. But it doesn't tell you what, it doesn't even have a critical analysis of what has happened with our PPP contracts and the difficulties that we've experienced with them. So it's not very helpful in that sense. So I think we need more such discussions to complement what the Niti Aayog has put up on its website for the education of the interested public. And the interested public are, of course, all of us, particularly in a public policy school, in the university, the law school, and everyone really who cares seriously about development and public policy should be interested in this. So those are the few words I wanted to say by way of why a conversation of this kind is important, because it's not that the going through several pages and 2 volumes that Niti Aayog has put out is going to make us all extremely well informed. We get some idea. We know there are 13 sectors. I don't know whether that number is an auspicious one or not. In some cultures, it's unlucky. In other cultures, it's not. But there it is. So I have great pleasure in inviting Dr. Vinod Surana, the managing partner and the CEO of Surana Surana International, to be the moderator of this dialogue. And he could have well been in our university as a professor with his impressive educational record at Harvard, Cornell, LSE, IIM, and so on. And I think Rajkumar will be after him from time to time to think about that option as well. He's been doing this with others. We've got some Gopal Subramaniam and others, who are in the legal practice teaching. That apart, I think he's extraordinary in that he's also a specialist in conflict management and resolution. There's a very famous program at Harvard on that subject, which he completed, and that's a very, very valuable set of skills. He's been a great asset to the state of Tamil Nadu, where his firm is located. He's been a member of the Tamil Nadu's high-powered committee for promoting defense manufacturing clusters. This is part of, Make in India that the Prime Minister keeps referring to. He's well known internationally, having traveled to several countries under the aegis of the CII and FICCI. He's published a number of books, including some that with the title Make in Tamil Nadu, which I just referred to, and the role of technology in biomedical waste management, new intellectual property rights policy, and so on. And so, he's a, well-rounded policy intellectual, lawyer. And so I'm very, very happy that we are partnering with him and his firm. And I'd like to hand over the proceedings to him to moderate this dialogue. He's a conflict specialist, and moderation somehow suggests that there would be, fierce arguments or battles that he has to moderate. But that's not the sense in which I mean moderate. It means to draw out what each of you has to can potentially contribute. And it's always helpful for someone to pose some questions to elicit more knowledge than might otherwise happen. So it takes a particular skill, and Dr. Surana has it in great measure. So I'm very happy to hand it over to him. Over to you, Dr. Surana.
Thank you, Professor. You were very generous with your introduction. Thank you very much. The way in which you spoke and introduced this subject, it made us all feel immediately comfortable. It takes a lot of maturity and a kind of seniority to be able to make everybody at ease. Thank you very much. My humble greetings to this extremely distinguished gathering, our distinguished panelists, and our distinguished participants. joining us all over from India. I am told they include representatives of industry, academia, current and serving members of the bureaucracy, and of course, common citizens. The common thread which binds all of us together as we participate in this program today is we are all looking to get different perspectives and insights into this very fascinating development, the National Monetization Plan, which is expected to impact our lives and our country in the years to come. As Professor Sudarshan mentioned, this is the 8th in the series of knowledge webinars which my firm has been conducting this year. And the main focus of this series is to choose an important topic of current importance and get prominent, distinguished, accomplished panelists to explain to us what they believe, what they feel, and how they see the topic in question. I have always been fascinated by public policy and developmental economics. It is fascinating to see how policy is made and how it materializes to touch the common man. We believe that the best way to quickly get an in-depth understanding into a subject is through what they call Chintan Manthan. Chintan meaning introspection, contemplation, thinking, and Manthan meaning to churn. We have 4 very distinguished, accomplished, and cerebral, if I may use that word, panelists, each having decades of experience in the field of policy, economics, public administration, and deep research. We are very grateful for their presence, and I will take a few minutes to introduce our extremely distinguished panelists. I will first like to introduce Mr. Arun Balakrishnan. Mr. Arun Balakrishnan retired in 2010 from the position of Chairman and Managing Director of the Hindustan Petroleum Corporation Limited, a Fortune 500 company. He is a graduate in chemical engineering and a postgraduate from IIM Ahmedabad 1976 batch. He has held many distinguished positions in his life, including being the chairman of the Scientific Advisory Committee, Ministry of Petroleum and Natural Gas, Government of India. He's been a council member of the Institute of Company Secretaries of India. He's a member of the Board of Studies of the University of Petroleum and Energy Studies, among many others. Currently, he is serving as the chairman of the Institute of Directors for Karnataka, and he's a non-executive independent director in many prestigious companies. Thank you, Mr. Arun Balakrishnan, for joining us.
Thank you, sir.
I have the pleasure of introducing next Dr. Arvind Mayaram, who holds a PhD in finance and is currently the Vice Chairman of the Rajasthan Economic Transformation Advisory Council, and he is also the Economic Advisor to the Chief Minister of Rajasthan. Mr. Mayaram has held many distinguished and responsible positions in his career, such as Finance Secretary, Secretary of Minority Affairs, Special Secretary in the Ministry of Rural Development, Government of India. He has been on the Board of Governors of the World Bank, Asian Development Bank, and the African Development Bank. He has sat on the boards of the Reserve Bank of India, the Securities Exchange Board of India, and he was the chief negotiator on India's behalf for the BRICS New Development Bank. The list of his accomplishments and positions held are very long. one very relevant point for our today's webinar is he is an acknowledged, internationally acknowledged specialist in the area of public-private partnerships. And I look forward to your insights into this area as we go ahead with the proceedings. Thank you for joining us, sir.
Thank you.
We have next Dr. Arpita Mukherjee, a professor at the Indian Council of Research on International Economic Relations. She has over 25 years of experience in policy-oriented research, working closely with the government of India, the governments of European countries, the United States, and the governments in the ASEAN region. She has a PhD in economics from the UK. She has worked in a very prestigious think tank in the UK called Policy Studies Institute. She has also taught in the University of Portsmouth and has more than 80 publications in national and international journals. Thank you, madam, for joining us today. The final panelist I would like to introduce today is Dr. Ajay Shah. He has a PhD in economics from the University of Southern California and a BTech from the Indian Institute of Mumbai. Dr. Professor Ajay Shah is a research professor. He has written almost 100 books and papers which have been published in very international publications all over the world. He has held very distinguished positions, such as he was a consultant to the Rand Corporation. He was the president of the Center for Monitoring of Indian Economy. He was a consultant to the Department of Economic Affairs, Ministry of Finance, Government of India. He was a professor of the National Institute for Public Finance and Policy, New Delhi, a research fellow at the Jindal Business School, senior fellow at the Pune International Center, a senior affiliated scholar at the George Mason University, among many others. Thank you, Professor Shah. Professor Sudarshan mentioned you are very busy. You are involved in so many different projects of very great repute. You have taken the time to join us today. Thank you very much.
Just to add, Ajay Shah has a wonderful blog, which is an immense knowledge source. And I encourage my students to visit, and a number of my readings, which I circulate to my students, thanks to you. So I'll take this opportunity to mention my gratitude to his blog, the Ajay Shah blog.
Wonderful, sir. I have a few random points to make on the subject of asset monetization, after which we will dive into the question answers. I will be failing in my duty if I do not express my sincere gratitude and thanks to Professor Sudarshan and the Jindal School of Government and Public Policy for partnering with us in this episode of the Knowledge Series. As an MOU partner with the Jindal University, we have had a couple of webinars with their various other schools earlier this year. So as was mentioned, monetization, asset monetization, many people think is the opposite of demonetization. Professor Sudarshan made it sound very simple, but many people have this confusion. So monetization, I believe, is basically trying to convert an asset into money. Asset monetization, I am told, and I see from various records, is not a new concept. 3-4 years ago, the Macquarie Group won the right to operate 9 stretches of roads under the NHAI for a total cost of about 9,680 crores. Last year, I am told, the IRB infrastructure backed the rights to collect toll for about 30 years for the Pune-Mumbai stretch, the expressway, on a toll operate transfer model. by paying the Maharashtra State Road Corporation about 6,900 crores. In 2014, when this current government came in their first term, they made a declaration: minimum government, maximum governance. And so the government, it was believed, expected to cede control of some of the public assets to the private sector, either through sale or by bringing them under the private operation for better and more productive use. In the 2019 budget, there was a high-pitched pronouncement on two areas, namely disinvestment and asset monetization. The current government's plan is significantly different from the earlier plans because of its very grand scale. It involves 12 ministries and includes 20 different categories of assets. While the initial results of disinvestment have not been very encouraging, like for example, sale of PSUs like BPCL, IDBI Bank, Container Corporation of India, they remain in a limbo, as they say. In August this year, the finance minister announced the launch of the National Monetization Pipeline, under which it intends to lease major public infrastructure to private players over the next 4 years for periods ranging between 15 and 30 years, with the hope of raising almost 6 lakh crores. That's a lot of money. This asset monetization is also expected to achieve 3 or 4 important goals, namely, help the government create new infrastructure to improve the economic growth, bridge budget deficits, and as they very popularly say, unleash the private sector's animal instincts. The Niti Aayog, in its paper, in its 2 volumes, has referred to such projects of asset monetization happening successfully in various countries, including North America, Europe, and Australia. I believe that this asset monetization program, which we are speaking about, is an attractive option for investors because they get to sidestep many of the financial risks which are involved in the infrastructure projects, such as construction delays, while the government also is able to avoid the charge that they are selling away the country's assets. I am told that this is a very opportune moment. Recently, the former finance minister, Mr. Jayant Sinha, pointed out that there is nearly $18 trillion glut in global financial markets. So there is a lot of liquidity floating around, and they expect to attract some of this, is what I read from the various sources. There are a couple of different models: the toll, operate, transfer, the operate, maintain, transfer, real estate investment funds and trusts, things like that. But also, I must hasten to add, there are certain major concerns which we have. Concerns on how these assets will be valued. Will there be a creation of monopolies? Are there any viable alternatives to this plan? What are the national security implications of this plan? Is this a garb under which privatization is taking place? What is the constitutional duty of the country, of the government? Is it not the duty of the government to give basic services free of cost to the citizens? So these are some of the points which we have. And with those few random points, I would like to now move on to our most interesting and expected part. We would like to hear the 4 panelists. I would request the 4 panelists to speak for a few minutes to lay out their thoughts from their respective experiences and perspectives, and then we will start the question answer session. So I would like to first call upon Dr. Arpita Mukherjee to please share with us her thoughts.
Thank you, Dr. Surana and Professor Sudarshan for considering me, and I'm really delighted to be here with the esteemed panelists. Basically the government has led the story, without telling who the actual villain is, because they began the story by saying that greenfield investment has not really worked that much in India. So somewhere there is a kind of a focus for a brownfield investment where you have to, where the private players are sought to come in. The core question is, who are going to be the private players? Likely for such big investment, it has to be either large domestic multinational companies or large international multinational companies that will be bidding for these projects. Now, when the foreign companies are bidding for the project, my first concern is that they have a worry, because we have done away with the bilateral investment treaties. We are not a member of the WTO government procurement agreements. We are not a member of ISDS. So, at the end of the day, if there is a dispute, the foreign companies run a risk, and this risk is even higher at the time of the COVID, where a number of other companies other than those in the technology field and some healthcare and some green technology, these kind of areas, they have all made some losses. So the infrastructure projects around the world are not moving as fast as we would expect. So I would assume they would have some worry. From a process point of view, if you look at certain processes, the ownership, the government ownership, let's say the Konkan Railway is somewhat owned by the center, some part of it is by the state government. Now, then there is a massive requirement to synergize between the multiple owners of these assets and how these owners behave. Third is that when you talk about heritage assets like hill railways and others, there is one thing that you preserve the tourism, you preserve the infrastructure, you preserve a lot of other things are associated with the asset, and the asset charging and the asset's access. Charging is also related to access. And in economics, often when ADB and others, they do toll roads, they actually look at other alternative connectivities between the two places. Like if you have a toll road between Delhi and Agra, what is your alternative route to go? The alternative can be larger, but often an alternative free access has to be made available in the case of an USO, and that is very important. Many countries are now giving away assets like hotels and other things, which are not, they call such strategic public sector assets, to privatization. But one of the worries in that is that what will the stadiums be used for? Well, whether they will be used for sports practices, or in case of Delhi, wedding and functions and events. So these are the alternative uses, because as a private sector, I would like to go in for the alternative use and money making. And can I, if I have to pay a hefty price to do that, can you stop me from, looking at all revenue options? Of course, the quality of service, we always talk about, whenever we talk about PSU privatization, we always bring into the picture, the PSU staff, and they are not, too overloaded with staff. Actually, they are not overloaded with staff. There are staff which are in certain sections, too many of them, and there are sections where probably if you need a lot of technology implementation, you will find a staff shortage. Now, how do you match the staff? How do you, put them under a private system of operation is again something which Arunji is more expert than me to talk about. And now when we are saying we are taking out the money from the infrastructure into the infrastructure, right? Now, money, once you collect, has a multiple use, and we really don't know how the money goes from one route to the other. And the bigger issue that I have is about customizing the international best practices. Many things happen internationally, they look very good. When we try to customize and make them, they become horrible. SEZ for manufacturing is one example. Every country does 5-7 SEZ, make them up and running. We made the world's largest number of SEZs, half of them are not running. So there are worries when you try to redo foreign things. Then what is the dispute settlement mechanism? Again, I go back to this because when I was talking about this with all the research that we are doing with the foreign investment, the only only worry for them is what is my dispute settlement mechanism. It is not only about a contract, it is about that mechanism. And there is another worry which came up is related to a third party access. You know, in case of telecom, India did sign a WTO regulatory principles on third party access, independent regulator, etc. But for all infrastructure, we do not have that kind of a multilateral regime in place, and that leads to, you know, data, information sharing, and all types of regulatory usage sharing, and that linked to national security. So I leave it here because I have eroded my 3 minutes, and I'll come back to it later after the other speakers.
Thank you, Professor. I did make notes. You brought out some very important points, so I will come back to you with some questions arising out of what you said. Now I would like to request Mr. Arun Balakrishnan to please express his views.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Surana. I think I will, since a lot of Arpitaji has spoken in great detail about various aspects, let me just start with the basic objectives of this program of monetization, which I read in the newspaper. I don't have any other access. The first one was funding ambitious infrastructure plans, bridge the budget deficit, and revive the animal spirits of the private sector. And the second was to revive public sector assets that have been performing far below potential due to inefficient state management. These were the statements which I read as being the objective of the monetization program. Okay. As far as if I was an investor in this program, obviously I'll have to pay upfront a certain amount, which I would calculate based on the net present value of the future income payments that would come into the business. But apart from this, I, as a lessee, would obviously need to invest very large sums of money to bring these assets to the required standards to attract paying customers. And hence, to recover these investments, I need to get adequate returns. Okay. And as far as the private sector is concerned, there is no charity in conducting bidding for these assets. And to make it profitable for them and worthwhile, you need at least a minimum of 25% return to cover all the risks of like inflation, war, new statutes, etc. that is coming in. Okay. The other is that the Indian economy itself is shifting to a more knowledge-based economy. Need for digitization is a given. They also have to take into account ESG, environment, society, governance, which is the order of the day. And the pandemic has changed the way business is done, and it will be very difficult to forecast how things will change. And 30 years is a long time. And there will be a lot of scrutiny on what they leave behind as well. These factors will determine the pricing power and the profitability when a private sector person gets into these areas. Okay. Since there is as the program takes shape, the issue of balancing profit seeking with public good would be a key area of contention. Okay. That is my concern for airports. For what I read is that Mumbai and Delhi airports have already become white elephants because they have literally been gold plated, and the cost for the traveler will become higher and higher. If almost all our airports go away and the airport charges go beyond a point, I think there can be a little bit of dissatisfaction amongst the traveling public as well. Consumers are worried about private monopoly, and when you talk about private monopoly, what immediately comes to my mind is again airports, and there has been a lot of criticism about that. The interesting thing is that the Indian industry is already an oligopoly. Just 5 companies account for something like 21% of all profits in financial year 21. Okay, so there are a lot of concerns as far as this is concerned. Okay, let me quickly get into the areas that I am familiar with my oil company background. Let me talk about petroleum product pipelines. These long distance pipelines were built for continuous evacuation, primarily of petrol, diesel, and kerosene from the refineries to the consumption centers. Any disruption in pipeline operations can result in having to reduce or curtail production in the refineries. Besides, the oil companies would not be too happy to give away these pipelines as they provide comparative advantage over competitors, as pipeline transportation costs are just a fraction of movement by any other alternate modes of transportation. If indeed these valuable assets are leased out, there must be enforceable service level agreements, or SLAs as we call them, between the lessor and lessee to ensure smooth operation and that there is no disruption in the supply of petroleum products to the consumers. PSU oil companies own majority of the pipelines and they have best-in-class expertise in operation and maintenance. Hence, monetizing these assets will only be to raise resources for the government. Same is the case with LPG and natural gas pipelines. The other issue that comes to my mind is that, these oil companies, including HPC, BPC, IOC, and GAIL, and for that matter, ONGC and Oil India, these are not 100% public sector companies. The government holding in these companies is in the range of 50 to 51 to probably 65%. So that means there is a large minority shareholders. And these days, in the era of activism by these minority shareholders, they are not going to sit quiet if a valuable part of the assets are taken away. And as you know, there are enough proxy advisors in the environment today who keep on advising all the minority shareholders what to do and what not to. So in this monetization program, all these things also need to be taken into account to make sure this is a success. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I now request, you had made a couple of very important points, activist shareholders, strategic assets being privatized, things like that. I will come back to you on that, sir.
Okay.
We now have Mr. Arvind Mayaram, whom I would like to request to please share with us your views on this topic from your experiences, your insights.
Thank you very much. I think we have already heard some very important points from the previous speakers. I would let me just list out 7 points that I would like to bring here. Some would be an overlap with what has already been spoken, but I think they are important and they must be spoken of. The first and most important, I think, is a lack of understanding when these lists were prepared as to what constitutes critical infrastructure. Every country has what they call critical infrastructure. In fact, one of the countries which is named in these documents of Niti Aayog is Australia, and Australia has enacted Security of Critical Infrastructure Act. And this act creates a framework for managing risks to national security relating to critical infrastructure. So do we have an understanding as to what constitutes critical infrastructure for the country? For instance, is ONGC a critical infrastructure in terms of energy security for this country? If it is, should this be privatized? Similarly, as was mentioned by Mr. Balakrishnan, the pipelines. If these are important for the energy security of the country, now can you imagine a multinational company coming and taking over these? And we have seen in the past, in fact, in the last 5 years, if you see, by the international arbitrations which have taken place against the government of India, the amount of money the government of India has had to pay out on account of non-performance, and any time, if for critical security reasons you were to given a direction to any of these pipelines to say divert a certain amount of their traffic into another refinery or take this to somewhere else, they could actually refuse and take it to an international court. So I think we have completely missed out on the most important part of preparing such a pipeline, of determining what we believe is critical infrastructure for the country and what should be the way in which we deal with this infrastructure. Second, I think it's becoming increasingly clear, and this was spoken of earlier also. I think Ms. Mukherjee spoke of this, that, or Mr. Balakrishnan, I'm sorry, I missed out who did this, but concentration of economic power. I think this is one of the most difficult areas that countries have to confront, especially in democracies, where economic power gets concentrated in the hands of the few, and then what consequences that follow are quite easily seen in many countries, especially in Latin America. We have seen governments were overthrown on account of concentration of economic powers in the hands of the corporations. So political destabilization occurs because of these economic. Anybody who has studied economic histories would know that this happens. Now, most economists define market power as the ability to control price and exclude rivals, which we have seen at great play even before 1991, when a few of them would garner all the licenses and not allow anybody else to come in. But economic power is more than market power. And this is something which we have to understand, where a corporation is willing to buy or sell any asset of any type in the economy to suit its strategic interests. In the early 80s, General Electric, GE, had bought close to 375 different kind of business activities just to increase its economic power before it was broken by the regulators there. So I think we have to be very clear what are we saying would happen with this kind of an economic power concentration. These assets will not be taken by everybody. There's not going to be very wide participation. We had seen in the earlier parts of PPPs in the road sector that most of the road bids were taken by rotating around 11 firms only. There weren't more than 11 firms which were fit to bid. And for these large infrastructure projects, we have yet to see how many companies would be fit to bid. And we have also seen in the past in PPPs and even large public-private partnerships that the bidding lead is taken by an Indian firm because multinationals are shy of getting into India and getting their hands sullied. The Vodafone is a classic example, which will now deter many foreign large companies to come and bid for Indian infrastructure projects. The third is transfer of public monopolies to private monopolies. Most of these projects which we are talking of are monopolies, and monopolies of any kind are bad, but it is established that private monopolies are much worse, far worse than public monopolies. And we have not dealt with this issue in our strategic thinking while preparing this pipeline. We have also spoken about valuation, which is going to be a major hurdle going forward. Basically, the valuation would be nothing but the net present value of the future earnings of the asset minus the O&M costs. But whereas it is simpler to do that for a linear project like roads, it is much more complex where the revenue streams are several. And we had seen this in Delhi airport bid, where there was a major contestation on what constitutes revenues, because there was a revenue share involved in it. And there was a lot of litigation on this. So valuation we have not seen any discussion on how valuation will be done. In 2013-14, when I was still with the finance ministry and we were developing the regulations for REITs and InvITs, one of the issues that had come in at that point of time, where we had indicated that going forward, the government, which is the finance ministry, will have to work on, is the formulation of methodology for arriving at valuation of such projects. Unfortunately, from 2014 till now, we haven't seen any progress in that, and this is going to be a big issue. The fifth one is availability of long-term finance. Ultimately, we can keep saying that the private sector will come in and finance this, but in all these kind of projects, the equity to debt is going to be mostly 1:4 or 1:3, in which case 3 parts or 4 parts will have to come from the financial institutions. Now, which are the financial institutions who are in a position to provide 6 lakh crores, so even if you say 4 lakh crores for infrastructure going forward in the next 3 years? is that money available? We are already seeing that the earlier projects in infrastructure, and this is where I would also like to come in and say that one of the contentions of the monetization is that inefficiencies of the private sector. If you look at the long list of projects before the bankruptcy law courts, they are private sector projects which have run into trouble, and very large number of them are infrastructure projects. So it is not, there is no certainty. And therefore, where would this finance come from? REITs and InvITs we had designed at that point of time to access capital market funds. But unfortunately, in 2018, we had earlier said REITs will not be able to source finance from banks. In 2018, banks were permitted to lend to REITs and now are merrily lending to the REITs. Whereas you would find that this will very quickly run into a kind of a firewall where there would not be enough finance going forward to be able to monetize these assets. The sixth I would like to say is in terms of the implicit guarantees in these projects, which means that government is going to run up huge contingent liabilities, even if the default is of the private sector. And these have not been accounted for. Dr. Shah is brilliant in his financial analysis. I'm very sure this will agitate his mind. How fiscal management will take care of contingent liabilities, which are going to become part of your fiscal balance sheet. With these kind of projects, if there was a default, if there was a failure of the private sector, the government would still have to step in, because these are critical infrastructure like gas pipeline. If the private sector is not able to run, government cannot say you go and do what you want to, go and become bankrupt. We don't care. We are not going to bail you out. That pipeline is required for the country to run, and therefore government will have to step in. Have we thought of how we are going to do backstopping of these contingent liabilities which are likely to pile up? And finally, are we prepared? Did we do our homework before preparing this monetization pipeline? In most cases, for instance, railways has been put out as one of the major sectors for monetization of assets. Now, in railways, the operator, railways also the regulator. We have seen in the case of container privatization of container movement, where they were competing with the railways. They compete, for instance, with the freight train of the railways get priority over a private train carrying the same thing. These are issues that have not been looked at all. Railways will run into a major mess if they don't have an independent regulator. In 2012, we had written to the railways, there's a huge note from Finance Ministry to have an independent tariff regulator. And only then you can have this kind of a monetization that you are talking about. This has not happened, and there is no indication that this is happening now. So I don't know how it would happen. And the same is in terms of the renegotiations. Now, in 30-year contracts, you would require renegotiations. There are some guidelines which have been brought out by the Finance Ministry on renegotiations, but these guidelines are not adequate. They have to be part of a law. Otherwise, the whole issue of CBIs and CVCs and running after people who are renegotiating these contracts, moral hazard involved in it, they're going to be a major issue. So I don't know whether we are really prepared in this kind of a thing. In fact, this is my problem with the bad bank also. We have seen, for instance, in bankruptcy court, the kind of money write-offs, the loan write-offs, the kind of haircuts banks have taken. I mean, it's become a big scam. I mean, if you really start analyzing bankruptcy settlements, it's a huge scam. So are we really prepared for this monetization, or is it just a feel-good thing that we are talking about? Going down the line, it may just not work. I'm really sorry I've taken much more time than you had offered to me, but then I had these written down. I needed to speak, so I thought I'll share them with you. Thank you.
Mr. Mayaram, you have really given a lot of food for thought. I don't know whether you inspired us to think or you instigated us to think, but anyway, we have started to think. Now I request research professor Dr. Ajay Shah to please share his views, his perspectives.
I want to put this in a strategic perspective. Arvind Mayaram has been part of this journey for 30 years, and I just want to tell that story in 3 minutes. Okay, so first, in the good old days, all infrastructure in India was built by the government, and that did not work out too well. Then we had this brilliant idea that we should have private sector participation in infrastructure. We came up with this whole PPP approach. In some ways, it has delivered some miracles. We've got some expressways and some world-class airports. The JNPT works immeasurably better than it did in the good old days. At the same time, that entire PPP story ran aground because there are fundamental limitations in 2 problems. One is the problem of government contracting, and the second is the weaknesses of the Indian financial system. To be a PPP developer, to be a PPP operating asset owner, you are in bed with the government in a deep embrace for 25 years with a poorly specified contract, with legal and policy risk about regulation, with courts that adjudicate in shambolic ways. This did not work out very well. So we all went through this great romance with PPP contracting, and in many ways, many things went wrong with it. So I personally remain convinced that PPP with private sector participation is the right way for India to do infrastructure. But we need to take 2 steps back, and we need to understand that there are difficulties in the foundations. There are 2 kinds of foundations required to make PPP infrastructure work. We need a modern, sophisticated, capable financial system. This takes us to problems like bond market and capital account convertibility and so on. And we need a sophisticated capability on the part of the government to enter into these kinds of contracts and build the regulatory capacity so that a private person has some reasonable confidence about what is going to happen in the next 25 years or 50 years. So then we got phase 3. In phase 3, roughly speaking, after 2012, 2013, the government started playing a bigger role because the PPP process was leading to difficulties. So we saw a faltering of PPP investment by about 2012, 2013, and we saw a significant surge of public sector investment. So we started going back to the good old days. And at the time I was writing and I was saying that we may temporize by exploiting more public sector investment, but this does not work for any extended length of time for 2 reasons. First, the government will choke on fiscal capacity. And second, all the old problems are there. The government chooses bad assets. The government builds assets badly. That there is value in bringing a private guy to put his passion into choosing what asset to invest in and in building high quality assets. By about 2018, that great push of public sector investment in infrastructure had faltered. One of the sources of the macroeconomic weakness in India in the post-2018 period is that retreat of public sector investment in infrastructure for the simple reason of fiscal capacity, that you cannot just keep growing at a significant rate on the back of the public balance sheet because the public sector is very weak financially in India. And that's what brings us to the present debate. It seems to me there are basically 2 ways out. One approach is to do outright transactions where the government is a good developer of a highway or a electricity generation utility, because in that development stage, there is just too much political risk and private people cannot bear that level of risk. So you have a government organization develop the asset and after that sell it off. Just sell it off lock, stock and barrel, and private people become the operating companies. Yes, you will have the concerns and the difficulties and the risk of future regulatory behavior by the government, but at least the asset is up and running. This is one way out. And then that money comes back to the government and the government can use it for the next wave of infrastructure development. So this is one plausible approach that can be taken. When Arvind Mayaram was in the Ministry of Finance, some of us were writing these kinds of things. And now we come to the second strategy, where the national monetization pipeline is being proposed as a way where it will not be an outright sale, but you will have a complicated contract with the government for 25 years. And this will generate cash for the government while the infrastructure operations goes to the private sector. This does bring money back to the government. So it addresses that problem that fiscal capacity basically ran out by about 2018. And from 2018 till today, we've had a decline in infrastructure investment. So it could be that this will bring money back. The really big question is, from the viewpoint of a private person, would you feel safe going to bed with the government in this kind of contract? Okay, and the compare and contrast really is with PPP investment. We saw n number of difficulties in PPP investment. The question that I would like to ask the learned panel and for all of us to ponder over is, to what extent would those same kinds of contracting difficulties, the behavior of a government department, the behavior of a government regulator, the behavior of a government PSU infrastructure provider, to what extent would all those difficulties afflict the national monetization pipeline? If we feel optimistic that those problems will work out better in this new mode, then yes, we have some grounds to be optimistic. If not, then this is not going to make too much progress when compared with the difficulties of PPP. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Shah. You were very clear and forthright. So now comes the most exciting part, the question answers. You have given us a lot of food for thought. Your phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, which is back to phase 1, that kind of analogy, it really sank in. Thank you, Professor. So I will start with Mr. Arvind Mayaram. He made 3 points which concerned the valuation of assets. He said that 60 to 65% of financing will come in through debt, which will be through financial institutions. Then he said there will be a lot of implicit guarantees by the government. And third, he said this whole thing is about transferring of government monopolies to private monopolies. We see a movement happening. So the question is, with implicit government guarantees, and again, financial institutions being predominantly controlled or influenced by the government, how can an asset be valued effectively? Given the fact that Professor Shah said 30 years of being in a close embrace with the government, different government after 5 years, every 5 years. So how will a private entrepreneur value, let us say, a port or a road or a power utility?
You're asking me the question,
Yes, sir.
but this
Yes,
is the
sir. How
question I raised.
The
So
question is how?
somebody, I mean, I don't have the answer. I said this is a problem. And
Yes.
but let me break down your question into few. And I think I would request Ajay to take at least 2 questions, which I think he's the most competent. And I've read a lot of his writings, and I think he has a brilliant mind. So I think one is, where will financing come from? You are dealing with a lot of capital market issues. And InvIT, if you recall, was designed actually. It's a unique instrument to India because REITs is known in other places, but InvITs was specifically designed for projects which have a finite life in terms of their being with the private sector. They could revert to the government at the end of it. But they didn't really take off because I think we have not been able to create enough understanding of risk for the private sector. Private sector is not being able to assess risk because in valuation, the most important part would be the risk premium that they have to bring into the pricing. So how do you see this? I mean, is our financial sector today in a position, number one, to be able to provide institutional or capital market finance in the present structure of governance of infrastructure projects? Like it was spoken of that there is a huge liquidity in the global market. This has always been there. I mean, in 2012, 13, 14 also, we were seeing a lot of illiquidity in the global markets. But it will not come in unless the risk can be properly assessed. Have we come to that stage where it is possible for them to do so, for the finances to flow into these projects which are being monetized now? Ajay, would you like to ponder on this?
Yes, sure. This has actually been the subject of 20 years of thinking and an attempt at the deeper financial system reforms. This led up to the establishment of the Financial Sector Legislative Reforms Commission, chaired by Justice Sri Krishna. This worked from 2011 to 2015. The most important ingredient required in the infrastructure sector is the bond market. Banks are structurally ill-equipped to hold the risk and the maturity profile of infrastructure assets. For many years, we tried to ignore this problem and make do by pushing these assets down the throats of the banks. That did not work very well. It got many banks into trouble, and then after some time, this peters out. So it's exactly like what I was saying earlier about trying to put it on the public balance sheet. You can do it for a short time, but then it peters out because it's really not a viable and sustainable course of action when we are talking of the incredible magnitudes of infrastructure investment in India. So, men and nations will do the right thing after trying every reasonable alternative. I think of the infrastructure sector as being that. We have spent a lot of years trying all kinds of B-grade solutions, and we should all hope that we have learned from these flaws. And in the field of finance, I think that there is a very clear message in the research community and in the policy analytical community that there is an animal called the bond currency derivatives nexus. This is missing in India today. It requires deeper reforms of RBI and SEBI. And it's a difficult project. It will take many years to execute. It will require sophisticated intellectual capacity at the Ministry of Finance, at RBI and SEBI. And it constitutes one important choke point for the ability to develop a sound infrastructure sector.
So you have the answer.
So this brings me to another question. Is this 2025 time frame a very ambitious one in the absence of the basic framework of financing? Professor Arpita Mukherjee, from your international perspective, have you seen such projects come up or flourish in the absence of a strong financial market? I mean, your views before I go back to Mr. Arun Balakrishnan and the others.
2025 is definitely a very ambitious time frame. If you even look at the international, even the current international scenario, and the ambition, why it is ambitious is not only the current international scenario, current ways in which India is entering into its partnerships with key investing countries. For example, India and US sat down to sign the investment agreement this year in April, and they couldn't get through. So at a country level also, when the companies go back to their USTR or the others, the USTR will say, okay, fine, there is a risk in India. We are not really considered to be extremely low risk in terms of signing, when we don't sign international agreements, treaties, and all of that. And I think foreign funding will not be like it will come with a lot of cautious.
Again, on the question of valuation, Mr. Arun Balakrishnan, you mentioned 2 points. One is constant upgrading and maintaining of the assets is required, and what will they leave behind at the end of the concession or the end of the contract? So how does the investor value today and put a number? Does the contract have to stipulate the condition of the asset when it is being left behind at the end of the contract? How does it go?
See, Dr. Surana, that depends on the kind of asset that we are talking about. Let me go back to my favorite petroleum pipeline example. Okay. Now, petroleum pipelines are built by the public sector. These are long distance pipelines. There's a lot of technology involved. There's a lot of capital investment involved. Okay. And most of these pipelines now over a period of time has been fully depreciated. Okay. The running cost of a pipeline is actually peanuts. Okay. So there is a challenge in actually, there is a information asymmetry really here. And a private party has no way of finding out what is the actual cost of the pipeline which he should pay for if he wants to, the down payment that he has to make. Okay. If he value it at book value, he's going to have a killing. I mean, profits. Okay. But if you take it a replacement cost, the cost would be so high that the per unit transportation cost will be so high that it will not be viable for the oil company to engage with them. Okay, so this is the issue which comes up as far as pipelines are concerned. Okay, I have not much knowledge about the other sectors, so I don't want to venture into that. But for pipelines, whether it is a gas pipeline, LPG pipeline, or natural or POL pipelines, so these are a challenge which is there as far as valuation is concerned. And if you will permit me, Dr. Surana, to make a comment on the earlier subject of financing the infrastructure. I am of the firm belief that the country needs infrastructure, okay, for ease of doing business, for increasing our GDP, for development of backward areas, etc. Now, do we wait for the financial markets to develop to invest in infrastructure? If we have not developed the financial markets in the last 70 years, how much more time will it take is my question. Sir, Professor Shah, I'm not challenging you, and this is my personal view. Like it is a chicken and egg story. Which comes first? Do we wait until the financial markets are ready? In my opinion, we should start with whatever way possible to ensure that the infrastructure is in place so that the country develops. And parallelly, all attempts should be made to develop the bond market or whichever other possible ways are there for financing. I do agree banks are a big issue because recently, during my last tenure, we started this public-private partnership refinery in Bathinda in Punjab. It's called HPCL Mittal Energy Limited. The private sector partner is Ellen Mittal, the famous person. Okay, so we have a partnership PPP model there, which has worked so very well in the last 10 years. And there are very reasons for that. I don't want to bore you with how we went about it. But there are answers to some of these problems. But my thing is that we should not wait for a bond market to develop before we invest in infrastructure. Thank you.
If I may quickly respond, the problem in this field is that the magnitudes of money are just scary, enormous. Okay, this is one field where we in India have become comfortable talking about trillions of rupees without batting an eyelid. They're very, very large sums of money involved. So, as I said, we tried putting it on a public balance sheet in the good old days. It didn't work out too well. We tried to make a rush for a PPP framework without waiting to fix the finance. We said the finance will happen in its own time. Some other people are going to fix finance. I'm an infrastructure guy. I just want to make progress. This was achieved by pushing a lot of assets onto the banks. And that's part of how we got ourselves into a big banking crisis. Then we got back in phase 3 to saying, no, I'll put it back on the public balance sheet. That worked for some time, roughly 2012 to 2018. We once again loaded up the public balance sheet, then the public balance sheet choked. So there is really no way. And so unfortunately, I do believe that a genuine, exuberant, large-scale infrastructure investment boom in India first requires us to stop and deal with the political economy and the intellectual and the capacity constraints in finance. As long as we fumble and fail on financial reforms, it is just further and further delaying our much desired infrastructure renaissance.
Mr. Mayaram, I see you. Do you want to say something?
No, what Ajay said, I think I just wanted to reiterate that the issue, Mr. Balakrishnan, is not that we should not. I mean, I don't think any one of us is at a divergence from your perspective or your view that we should have infrastructure. And the question, but the problem here is money is something which is tangible. It is not conceptual. So if the money is not there, if you see the kind of NPAs the banks have run up, the banks, they have not been recapitalized to the extent that they need to be recapitalized if they have to start lending in such large numbers again. So, I mean, however much we may want, and the fiscal deficit of the government now is close to 10%, I mean, there is just no way that you can find any money anymore. So we'll need to bite the bullet, as Ajay was saying, and we'll have to reform the financial sector very quickly. And it's not difficult, actually, unlike a railway system or otherwise, because there are, kind of real assets which you need to change. Meter gauge to broad gauge may take a long while. But in the financial sector, it will take much lesser. It's basically regulation and our desire to accept that we need to free the bank, even for the banks, for instance. Is there a need for the banks, public sector banks, to be governed by a separate regulation and private sector banks to be governed by a Reserve Bank of India regulation? Why is it that the Reserve Bank of India cannot regulate public sector banks? Does it take very long to do this? But nobody is interested in doing this, even though we tried at our point. When I was there, it didn't go through because of political reasons, and it isn't going through now also for political reasons. So we have to take that call.
May I make one comment, Dr. Surana? So I fully agree with what you say, but my issue is that, look, a part of the problem of financing is also because the pricing of the product that you're putting in place is not right. You take the power sector. I mean, you're giving power free. And so how will the power companies ever be profitable? So I think
that's all part of that. So that's all the part of fixing that we have to do. I agree with you. But as Ajay said, this is political economy. We need to, somebody has to catch the bull by its horns. But unless we, first acknowledge it is a problem, and without solving this problem, nothing can happen. Change will not happen. In India, unfortunately, only crisis pushes the government to act. 1991 is a classic example.
So listening to all of you, it begins to appeal to me what Professor Shah said. Do outright transactions, sell 100%. But again, like Mr. Mayaram said, there are political issues and compulsions involved. So Professor Arpita Mukherjee, from your international experience, have you seen places where governments have sold assets instead of going through the whole process of monetization due to lack of strong financial markets? Can you throw some light?
As we were looking at the public sector enterprises across the world, many countries have actually remodeled or sold many of the assets. But when they sell the assets, they actually look into the assets under different categories, like the strategic and core assets and non-core assets, and they begin by selling the non-core assets, which are like the hotels and many other things that the government has. Of course, their pricing is much, the pricing is much lower than the kind of money that we plan to raise through these 13 sectors, which also has many non-core sectors. Now, focusing on toll road globally has been fairly successful in many countries, including many ASEAN countries. So toll road model has worked. I haven't looked into all the models, but I have looked into the toll road model, the non-core asset models, and the core assets model. And within the core assets, like public sector enterprises, Arunji is talking about a lot of public sector enterprises. See, when you have so many subsidiaries and things like that, the whole public sector model that you try to initially sell is almost non-sellable, with a lot of non-profitability, subsidiaries, and all of that. So there is need for an internal reform and making a product a sellable product. And I think we haven't really gone into that stage of making a product a sellable product, putting the data and systems in place. Like, it is a 3 to 4 years effort that goes in, and that seems to be missing in India. Like, we talk about a sale, and again in the next budget we talk about a sale, but there is nothing really drastic happening inside the organization to make it sellable. So these are some of our research findings that we have. Definitely, the way in which countries look into their public sector enterprises and use them are different. The way that China look into it as a very strategic way to go forward and look into BRI and others. All Chinese public sectors are not doing well. They look into it in a different way. But Singapore model is now, Singapore has made a model which is really where the public sector has become like an investor, like their public sector is investing in Indian startups. So they have made a model which is more driven by financing and financial model, which Indonesia and other countries are trying to pick up. I have not gone deeper into it, but that is an interesting model that we need to look into. When we are looking into business partnerships and fundraising and collaborations, we also need to look into R&D, innovation, ideas, like and that will actually, reduce the fear of monopolization also. When you bring in multiple, smarter players who can become big, who has a potential to be unicorn but is not unicorn, can be roped in for better management and structuring. Not necessarily that the top 5 will bring in all the better management technologies or multiple resources. So this needs to be thought about. I think the bigger worry here is that it all happened very suddenly. You have a Niti Aayog report, and it talks about a big bang reform without and India has been used to fairly slow pace of reform. So I think there is also a fear of unknown that comes here with this policy, where the research is somewhat nobody knows what went behind it.
Okay, so I would like to now go to Mr. Arun Balakrishnan. I remember I had a conversation with you, sir, and you were you believed very strongly in public sector institutions, and you believed that if the public sector institutions are unshackled, then the efficiency will improve drastically. For example, you used the example of 24 parliamentary committee meetings to be held in a year, and so many oversight meetings and things like that. So do you think that unshackling the public sector in some way, structured way, would be an alternative to monetization? They will improve the efficiencies, bring down costs.
Thank you, Dr. Surana, for giving an opportunity to talk about the public sector. First of all, there is an Indian mindset, okay, which is that when they compare the public sector with the private sector, The private sector, they talk only about the top 25 companies, which are very profitable, which have good products, everything, good management, the whole works. And when they talk about the public sector, what comes to mind is the worst of the public sector companies. They don't talk about oil companies, they don't talk about ISRO, they don't talk about all the technology companies, etc. BML or a whole lot of them which are doing wonderful work. Okay, so there is a mindset issue in this saying the public sector is bad. Fair enough, I accept that. I have no quarrels with that. Somebody wants to believe that is the case. Okay, now the public sector, now I was a chairman of a public sector company, and I was on the board of that company for almost 9 years, first as a director, then as a chairman. Every year, as you rightly said, some 20 odd parliamentary, there are 24 parliamentary committees in the country. Okay, every year, something like 15 to 20 of them come and they have conduct these meetings in some part of the country or the other. A lot of management time gets occupied there. Okay, plus there are a lot of other issues. I'll give you a simple example of what the CEOs of public sector companies face. We were building that refinery, that JV joint venture, public-private partnership refinery. 20,000 crores was the cost in Batinda in Punjab. Okay, Punjab was an Akali government at that point of time, and the then ruling dispensation, political dispensation, was asking, why is this company going and putting a refined 20,000 crore investment in an opposition ruled state? And this was told to me by my own minister, the late Mr. Mukherjee Devara for that matter. He says, look, everybody is asking me, why is this guy going and putting a refinery there? So, I mean, these kind of challenges are continuously there, and we have to keep on justifying, saying, look, this is the best location for a refinery to run profitably. We have a pipeline coming from the coast and a product pipeline going to the entire north where there was a paucity of product. So these are the challenges which are there. And apart from all the 3 C's that we talk about, if we can kind of reduce the impact of those 3 C's, because most of the government policies relating to the administration is based on mistrust, whereas the private sector is trust that comes in. This issue of mistrust needs to be handled. Otherwise, the public sector won't survive. And this is my opinion about it after having spent a lifetime in the public sector. Thank you.
I'd like to go to the next important issue which is troubling all of us, and that is about the possible creation of monopolies. Both Mr. Arvind Mayaram and Professor Ajay Shah spoke about the creation of monopolies and the possible negative impact. How can we address this issue? Will a strong competition commission like on the antitrust, how it happens in the US, will that be a way to prevent monopolies from emerging or arm twisting? Professor Shah.
In this field, it's very easy for us to demand a lot from a regulator. But frankly, under Indian conditions of state capacity and also the kind of mistakes that we have been making in the fundamental drafting of the laws surrounding regulators, these things are very difficult to achieve. So prevention is better than cure. And my main answer would be that can we systematically do the transactions in such a way that monopolies do not develop? I want to talk about one example and a second situation and a broad strategic thinking on the possibilities. In my mind, the greatest example was from the late 90s and the 2000s, where at JNPT, there is a port and it could easily have turned into a single vendor monopoly. In fact, there are 4 berths in JNPT. One is a PSU, and Mr. Balakrishnan will agree with me that there is value in having one PSU operating a berth because they create benchmarks of cost that are important for the regulatory process. And then the other 3 berths have been contracted out to 3 different vendors. So we've created intra-port competition rather than one giant monolithic JNPT, which is only controlled by one vendor. And I thought that was such a brilliant approach that was taken by a succession of different policymakers over a period of 10 years. Just to stubbornly push competition as an important priority in this field, not relying on the regulator to sort things out after the competition has become a problem. Second, I want to bring up the case of the new Bombay airport. I think it's really a pity that the old Bombay airport and the new Bombay airport are controlled by the same person. It would have been so easy to establish a bidding procedure where everybody in the world is welcome to compete, but the one vendor who controls the old airport in Bombay should be disqualified for bidding for the new airport in Bombay. And finally, I feel that the most important way in which we can get competition in this field is to remove the barriers that prevent foreigners from operating. Because finally, within India, we are down to 10 families who will do all this. The real opportunity to obtain 100 companies operating all over the Indian infrastructure space is by embracing globalization and bringing in much more foreign participation.
Let me just say one thing here. There is a problem, and I agree with Ajay that there is a capacity issue, but also just not the capacity issue. I think it is also the manner in which regulators are being designed. Because today, for instance, there is a conflict between sector regulators and competition commission. Look at telecom regulator. And then you also have an issue of regulatory capture. So when Ajay was saying about New Bombay Airport, there is at one point of time when I was still in the finance ministry, a circular had gone out that no single kind of company would be allowed to bid for more than 2 airports in India. That still is there. But you look in the case of Adani's, that was waived, and they got 6 airports right away. There is this whole issue of regulatory capture, which you will see also in this monetization pipeline. Once you allow the private sector, and that's where the one question which I mentioned about the concentration of economic power, because they become so powerful, they can capture the regulator. Look at the case of Geo, in which they gave for 15 months or 2 years free voice to their customers. And this went to TRAI. They said, no, this is all right. This doesn't hit competition. The others were not allowed to. And the Competition Commission upheld the decision of the TRAI. So the problem here, that's why we need to have a very hard look at ourselves before we really start talking of our becoming the 3rd largest economy or 2nd largest economy, etc. Are we really designing ourselves in a manner that we will achieve it? Or are we still floundering in the old manner of doing business, which continues, unfortunately? Nothing seems to change ever.
Just as I was going, yeah, Professor Shah.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And I just want to pause to think a little more about what was just said. We've seen in many episodes in history, Soviet Russia, Japan before 1986, China, we see a big state-led push to try to rapidly do some investment. And it works for a short time, and then it peters out. Okay, and I feel that's something we should think about. There is a role for far more intellectual thinking and care and effort in establishing some of these fundamental foundations. Are we creating government monopolies? Is the government becoming a central planner? Are we creating monopolies in the country? In the short term, it looks nice. We're getting a new airport. But in the long term, we can sacrifice the fundamental competitive energy of the country. So I feel many times state-led mobilization is a poor pathway to sustain economic prosperity.
I'm thoroughly enjoying this conversation. It is really opening up a lot of thoughts and ideas in my mind. Time is of essence, so we have 3 topics to cover before I would like to call this webinar to a close. One is national security issues, second, legal issues, and third, the constitutional the constitutional duty of the government. So let us speak about quickly the national security issues. Mr. Arun Balakrishnan and Mr. Arvind Mayaram and Professor Shah spoke about strategic assets, whether it has national security implications, should ONGC be, for example, privatized, things like that. So what are your views on these various sectors which have been identified under this plan? Mr. Mayaram, from the national security point of view.
No, so that's why I am not very sanguine that enough thinking has gone into it. I think if you go sector by sector, you may find that some of them will just not go because the government itself will not allow this to go. I mean, it may be on the list, but when the chips are down, the government might just say, push it to the end of the line because we are not ready to, allow the private sector to come in here. So therefore, I don't think that this list is going to run the manner in which it has been designed. There are going to be a huge number of changes in this on this count, because sooner or later, someone or the other is going to come up and tell them that from the national security point of view, perhaps it's not a right thing to do. And so we have to see. We have to wait and watch.
Before Professor Shah speaks, in the last 10-15 years, we have seen countries like China weaponize everything. And we are seeing a lot of ransomware, cyber security breaches. And on the other side, we see on the menu of the NMP, we have assets like telecom, power generation and transmission, things like that. So while we speak about strategic assets and disinvestment or monetization, also, if you may share some views on how protected we are in this internet economy. Professor Shah.
It is easy to envision some scenarios where there are national security problems, most notably around infrastructure, around telecom. So, the concerns about the Huawei switches are absolutely correct. That Huawei is controlled by the Chinese military, and that there should be no space for Huawei switches in the mainline Indian telecom and internet infrastructure. But I can also paint opposite examples. If there is a highway from Bombay to Nagpur, it is the most harmless asset in the world, and we should be perfectly okay if the Chinese government itself puts capital, or a Pakistani government, or any source in the world, because there's nothing you can do. You can anyway see the map of the highway from Google Earth, so there is no downside. So I feel we should be sophisticated about this, and yeah, there is a role for some national security restrictions to friendly powers, and it's got to be done intelligently. The puzzle in India is how to not collapse into sweeping positions, but cultivate sophistication and nuance. That's the missing link in what's happening around us in India today.
Right. The next point of concern, all the panelists spoke about the legal system, the delivery system. In the last, at least in the last 6-7 years, we are seeing this current government give enormous thrust towards private dispute resolution in the form of arbitration and mediation. And the Indian Supreme Court in the last 4 years has again and again and again emphasized that they will not interfere with arbitration proceedings or arbitral awards unless it is one of those rarest of rare cases, and they are holding on to that line. So in this context, what is your view? I mean, is this really a challenge, the legal scenario? We did see a problem with the PPP model and how they all got cogged in the courts. But now do you see a different scenario emerging?
You want me to say something?
Yes, go ahead, sir.
Okay. See, one big problem is like when Ajay was saying lack of capacity in the state, it includes the judiciary. And the public-private partnerships, many of the courts have pronounced again and again, because the private sector is building public infrastructure, therefore they are subject to the scrutiny that goes into public sector projects. So how do you procure cement? At what price? Was it competitive price or not? This is something you should know. Comptroller and Auditor General of India has been persistently for the last 10 years demanding that PPP projects, including the books of the private sector, should be open to them, because public monies are being used. The future earnings of the asset are actually basically the monies that government should have earned, which the private sector is taking and using, and therefore it should be open to CAG audit. I think the first thing that they should have started with is to have a PPP law, Public-Private Partnership Act, which would clarify many of these things. The courts will know what this animal is all about. There are very few people, even within the government, who understand it. In the courts, I think even lesser people understand what public-private partnership really entails. And I think, therefore, we need to understand that our legal system is yet not equipped to deal with this. Same is the question of renegotiation. So if you have signed a contract under the Specific Contracts Performance Act, you have signed a contract, whether your traffic has fallen or gone up or down and you are in difficulty, it doesn't matter. You are bound by the contractual terms and you have to deliver. This is what the government says to the private sector. This is what the courts have been saying to the private sector. And therefore they run afoul and they default and the things goes into a problem. So I don't think our regulatory system is equipped to deal with this as yet. And we need to look at the regulation or regulatory framework very carefully to see how we need to redesign it for it to be able to deliver in the manner in which we are expecting. When we have these huge pipelines, I mean, you have a monetization pipeline and then you have an infrastructure pipeline of spending 1 lakh crores every year, which the Prime Minister has announced last 3 Independence Day speeches, which means every year if you have to spend 1 lakh crore, that contracting also is going to be a problem. It's not just the demonetization contracting.
Before I request Professor Ajay Shah to respond, I just want to put Professor Sudarshan on notice. Even though I was told you are not going to participate, you are going to witness, I would like to ask you, after I hear Professor Shah, you as the head of the School of Governance and Public Policy, and as a part of a university which has the country's #1 private law school, do you have any program existing or in the pipeline to deal with the legal issues, regulatory issues, and such privatization? So I will come back to you. I will first hear Professor Ajay Shah.
Very quickly, I am 100% aligned with everything you said about arbitration. It is a great way forward for the country. My understanding is courts have systematically interfered with arbitration over and over, to the point where many legal persons in India no longer feel confident in the behavior of arbitration and the ability of the willingness of courts to reopen arbitration awards. A lot of India private transactions are preferring to go to Singapore arbitration and particularly London arbitration, because they want a mature legal system. So that's something I feel that the law fraternity has to really focus on and solve. And the other point I would like to always push is we have a lot to do on elementary process improvements of the courts and tribunals. I just pasted a URL into the chat about how we can establish the institutional arrangements for better functioning of courts. These are fundamental barriers that impede the emergence of a rational infrastructure sector.
Professor Arpita Gupta, any thoughts you have on international comparative study on the impact of the legal system? Have you seen any scenarios where large infrastructure projects have come up with the participation of the private sector in the absence of a strong formal dispute resolution system?
See, Dr. Surana, nowadays the large part of the private investments are coming to the developing country. Even companies from developed country, because their own market is saturated, comes to the developing country. And developing country, many countries are there in Africa and other region in Asia, where the problems that we face in terms of our legal systems are also there. There are legal system issues, but what international what countries are doing is trying to, they don't interfere into the internal legal system of a developing country. But what they try to do is they try to have an international mechanism. Like Ajay pointed out that, the cases are being resolved in Singapore or UK. That option was there because we had a bilateral investment treaty, or we have an agreement or the Singapore trade agreement that we had, which allows companies to reroute their investments through Singapore. And that's why they were using the Singapore trade agreement to, like Vodafone used the Singapore trade agreement rather than any other agreement. It didn't use the, it is a UK company, but it still used the Singapore agreement to bring its case forward. So what I'm trying to say is that, developing countries always do not have a judicial system as efficient and as fast track as the developed country system, but sometimes they do put in a fast track dispute resolution mechanisms, or else they put in some kind of a, which is a very, very bilateral agreement with certain countries and region, and which is a mandatory requirement. Like if you are going for if you look that India is going to sign an new investment agreement or a US agreement, I don't think we can move forward with any trade agreement with these kind of countries without having a strong investment chapter with a strong investment dispute chapter. So this is something that we may need to think about, and how we design such a chapter is also very, very important for us. That it should not be always weighed too much in favor of the foreign companies. It should have a, what you call it, a equal level playing field, and a proper way of designing that chapter. We need to have a relook at it. At the moment, I think that is something which is a major problem in case of India.
Professor Sudarshan, we have a brilliant academician, research professor like Dr. Ajay Shah. You are heading one of the finest institutions, the government, the School of Government and Public Policy, and you have a dynamic vice chancellor who is also the dean of India's top law school. Do you get any ideas of putting a course together which can address the capacity building issues on the legal front for such projects?
Well, thank you very much. This has been a very, very rich and very well-informed discussion. Certainly, we need courses. In the literature, when you study economic history and the growth of countries, the general view has been, the argument has been that countries that have a good rule of law system, good institutions, they are prerequisites for prosperity and growth. And countries that don't have it, by implication, are not going to get much growth and development. But to that general view, the exceptions are India and China, right? India has, what looks like the basic framework of a good rule of law system. Everyone can have a day in court. The constitution is very detailed and is very clear. It guarantees a number of rights and so on. And yet it's a very, very dysfunctional legal system. So it looks like we are a rule of law society, but in fact, we are not. And that's a problem. And so in that sense, the thesis that this is a prerequisite, but then there's also a big danger. I mean, and this was alluded to in some of the comments with respect to the political economy or the nature of our political party systems and our functioning of our democracy based on political parties which are beholden to a certain number of institutions, big corporations, for getting their finances. So our elections and so on, that's another serious problem. See, in the case of China, it's an authoritarian system. The Communist Party has a stake in everything. So if I'm going to go and invest in China and I know that in this local government, the local Communist Party has a significant investment in this enterprise, I would be quite happy to invest there because I know that the party will make sure that that enterprise does not get into trouble and does not go bust. Now this flummoxes the general argument about rule of law because it's an authoritarian system. The party can make these decisions. It can guarantee you the stability that you want as an investor. The party is there. It's not going to go away tomorrow, and it's got a substantial stake in the enterprise in which you're going to invest. So you invest. You don't worry about whether the courts in China are independent, or that every court has a party member sitting alongside the judge. That doesn't matter, and we have a lot of foreign investment going into China. But we have a peculiar problem, right? We have all the appurtenances of a rule of law society, the form of it, but in substance, it is so fragile and rotten. And so we need many courses to understand this. And the big problem really for our economic development is our politics. And I think we have to confront that. Just to think in economics terms will not get us answers. We need to seriously confront some issues about how our democracy is run and how well informed is the public. I mean, we generally place a lot of faith in our electorate that when it comes to the crunch, when people care about freedom and there's a party that imposed a state of emergency, lock, stock and barrel, our electorate removed it. But that doesn't mean our electorate is not vulnerable to other kinds of inducements in terms of divisions and all of that. So the state of our politics is really very vital. We can talk about all of these other fixes, but when it comes to making decisions and making policy decisions, at the end of it, it is our political masters, and we need to do something about that. So I think Dr. Surana, we should organize a series of information sessions with legislators, particularly to get across to them that they have a very vital role. And this myopic, it's a crisis of representative democracy. Our representatives are representing their own individual interests. They're not representing the country and the public in the country who vote for them. And we need to tackle this. And one way, of course, is, the digital technology, all of these things may help. But that's what I'd say. That's why my school is called Government and Public Policy. It is not simply public policy, because government and the nature of our government is important.
Professor, you gave a great idea that I should do more such knowledge series with the legislators.
Yes.
What I have found in my experience is what they say in private, they will never say on screen. So anyway, two last questions. One is to deal with, on one side, the central government says we are going to monetize our assets. On the other side, they say that we are going to give incentives to the state government to disinvest. So why is this, what is the rationale behind this? Mr. Mayaram?
No, rationale behind this is basically, I think the intention is good intention. The state governments have also run up huge fiscal deficits. Their own capacity to raise resources has shrunk thanks to the government of India largely. But whatever the reason be, the states don't have resources for any further development. So even if they have to do infrastructure development, which is important, they don't have the required resources. So the government of India is trying to put some incentives into the system for monetizing the state assets so they can raise resources for fresh investments.
Professor Shah, do you think there is a serious concern that in this whole process, the best assets would be taken by the private sector and the government will be left with the least productive assets? So which brings us to the point which Dr. Arpita Mukherjee made in the beginning. Nobody knows. She said money collected from one source, where does it go? Will money collected from one source go back to supporting those less productive assets? Your views on that, sir?
Once an asset is in operation, the diligence process will generate data about the tolls. So you may have spent 50,000 crore building an airport, but if that airport is generating 1,000 crore a year of revenues, then the private bidder will commensurately factor that information in when figuring out the bids. So I feel that getting an asset to the point of full operation and tolling for one whole year profoundly changes the information architecture of the situation. So good, bad, all that is history. It's sunk cost. Maybe I should not have put 50,000 crore in the past to build this asset. What is this asset worth today? It's the NPV of the 1,000 crore a year that is coming out. So in that sense, I feel this is less of a problem once you get to an operating asset.
Right. Final question from a theoretical point of view. As a citizen, when I listen to such enlightened conversations, the question which comes to my mind is, I am an honest tax-paying citizen. Maybe I am one of the minuscule minority, but for my taxes, the government has a constitutional duty to give me a good road, give me good power connection, should not come back to me and ask me for more money in terms of usage for the airport or in terms of tolls on the roads. So what is your view on that, Professor Shah?
I think the primal foundations of civilization are where all of us as citizens should focus. What we need is a Republic of India where absolutely basic things work correctly, namely the criminal justice system, free and fair elections, the judiciary. If we can get some of these basics right in the next 25 years, that will be a great achievement. This is particularly a reason why a lot of the economic sphere should go over to the private sector, while you do need a core of a government that will establish some policy frameworks and regulatory frameworks. Our number one challenge in India is just basics. We don't have a criminal justice system that works. We don't have free and fair elections. We don't have a judiciary that works. These are the primal challenges that we face in the country.
Dr. Surana, if I may, I was in an interesting discussion on Afghanistan with an Afghan scholar who explained that for the Taliban, they have medieval Islam, and the Taliban conception of the state is the first thing that it should do is to enforce criminal law, punish those who are wrongdoers, and make it aware that everybody that it's a very good system that will immediately mete out that kind of retributive justice. And it is the other thing is it has no idea of a welfare state and the state taking on responsibilities to provide education, health, this and that. In medieval Islamic conception of the state, peace, law and order, punishing the criminals is what there is. So now we have that Taliban state, right? Now I'm saying that civilizationally we've advanced from the medieval ages, and we have to have a more sophisticated understanding of what citizens can expect of the state. And we certainly expect of the state one of the things that the Taliban is prepared to deliver, which is a good criminal justice system, right? Other things we've added on, and that's a legitimate expectation of the state. But to have a hopeless criminal justice system makes the Taliban look better than us.
I don't know, surprising.
Very interesting perspective, yes.
Dr. Surana, Dr. Surana, if I may add, our study shows that even if a middle class Indian who is a honest taxpayer is willing to pay, as I had told you during our last interaction, is willing to pay a base price. The question is not about the willingness of the price, but the price amount. So even if I'm traveling in the airport and I get certain facilities and fast track clearances, there are charges that a person is willing to pay, and there are charges that a person is not willing to pay. Now, airport users are not only passengers. Airport users are also express delivery, cargo company, multiple users are there. So if they are getting a good facility, they will be willing to pay for the service. But the problem sometimes happen is when you are paying and you are not getting the service. So that is where I think there is a big worry among the middle class.
We have overshot time. This has been an amazing experience. I would like to go on and on, but all good things have to come to an end. when I say amazing, amazing experience, I am not trying to just say something to make you feel nice. This panel, it's very rare for me to come across such panels. You had absolute conceptual clarity, and that is what our viewers wanted. You gave us conceptual clarity, you gave us anecdotes, examples to drive home the point, and most importantly, you used language which was very simple and easy to understand. I want to thank the wonderful panel. This has been a great learning experience for all of us.